Greetings. Greetings, everyone, and thank you for joining me. Firstly, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the Winjabal Waibal country in the Bundjalung Nation, in which I live and from which I am zooming to you. And I would like to pay respects to the elders of present, past, and future. I'm coming to you from Lismore, in the sometimes very flooded northern rivers of New South Wales, Australia. In this presentation, I'd like to discuss the principles and practices of the teachings of the Buddha as they relate to being a human, including our mental health. And it is based, this presentation is based on a chapter that I've written with a colleague in Brazil, actually, a psychiatrist. And it is from this text called Spirituality and Mental Health Across Cultures. And the title of this chapter is Principles and Practices of Buddhism in Relationship to Mental Health. And please understand that my motive in presenting about Buddhism is not to proselytize, nor to convert you to a religion, but it is based on an invitation for you to consider practical perspectives and strategies to be free from psychological suffering. There is a term in Pali which is ehipassiko, and it means to come and see for yourself. As far as I understand, the Buddha used this term to encourage us to investigate for oneself rather than believing what other people are saying. And though I respect and revere the institutions that have arisen as a result of the Buddha's teachings, my personal understandings and the practice of these teachings is not as a religion. Perhaps this is the meaning of the term secular. I'm really not quite sure, but what I do know is that from personal experience, the teachings are liberating on many levels. These levels range from the profoundly spiritual to the more mundane and everyday struggles we may have with stress, anxiety, and depression, and also with conflictual relationships. So, in respect of that invitation to come and discover for yourself, to come and see for yourself, I'm going to invite you to an experiential exercise of becoming present. I invite you to construct a posture that's comfortable. And you can leave your eyes open if you wish, or close them, whatever you feel is best for you. And I invite you to settle into your posture. Putting aside worries and concerns about things not here. Putting aside roles and responsibilities and the burden of carrying around an ego. Putting aside fictitious stories about the future and the past. And a me that is the main protagonist of your mind movies. Just put them all to rest for the moment and find some seclusion, inner seclusion, from the hindrances in your life, and come into contact with the realities of being here now, just here now. And one way we can do that is by grounding in the experience of contact with the earth, feeling the earth beneath us, Mother Earth supporting us, feeling the contact with the chair or the cushion, and letting your awareness settle into that. just being present, just here now. So thank you. What I'd like to do is to present a framework of the teachings of the Buddha. Not all the frameworks. It's quite a comprehensive systems. There's a number of different systems in the Buddha's teachings. Just talking about one framework here, which involves the Four Truths, the Four Noble Truths, and the fourth truth being the Eightfold Path. So I'd like to talk about the Eightfold Path. And within the Eightfold Path, there's wisdom, ethics, and meditation. There's three groups. I'd like to talk a little bit about meditation, and then talk about the different aspects of meditation, primarily the serenity or the calm aspect and the insight aspect of meditation. After that, I'm going to invite you to a reflection, and then I'll talk a little bit about how I've integrated the teachings of the Buddha in my practice as a clinical psychologist. And then following that, we'll have some questions and discussion. As far as I understand, the Buddha talked about suffering and how to be free from it. In the first discourse he gave to the five ascetics, he expounded four realities. And these realities have come to be known as the Four Noble Truths. These realities describe a pair of cause-effect relationships: suffering and its causes, and freedom from suffering and its causes. And the slide shows these four noble truths and four ennobling truths. And the first truth is that there is dukkha. Dukkha is often translated as suffering, but it's probably best understood as unsatisfactoriness. Second noble truth is that suffering has a cause. Third noble truth is that there is freedom from suffering, or freedom from dukkha. And the fourth noble truth is that there is a way. There's a way to freedom from suffering. These four noble truths are adaptable. They're adaptable to all forms of suffering or all forms of dukkha. And I'm just presenting here the four truths from a medical model perspective. With a medical model perspective, you can, the first truth would be that there is disorder, there is imbalance, there is disharmony, there is illness. There are, this is a reality. The second truth is that there is an etiology for illness. Illnesses have a cause. The third truth is that we can address the etiology, and it is possible to be healthy, balanced, and harmonious in our physical health. And the fourth truth is that there are treatments and there are healing pathways. And as I said, you can adapt these to this formulation of the four truths of suffering and its causes, or dukkha and its causes, freedom from dukkha and its causes, to all sorts of experiences. And we're just thinking about happiness here. And there are times when we are miserable and unhappy. This could be considered as the first noble truth, or the first ennobling truth. 2, there are causes and maintenance factors for our unhappiness. 3, it is possible to be happy, peaceful and free. It is possible. And 4, there are ways that we can increase our happiness and find peace. And for those psychologists amongst us, you could even adapt these four truths to a CBT models. And in the first truth, there's the reality of there being presenting problems or disorders. This is true. We see all sorts of conditions and disorders in our profession. The second truth, there are causative factors for how and why the problems may have developed, and maintaining processes that keep the problems from arising. 3, the third truth, it is possible to be free from the problems, or at least reduce the severity of the symptoms. And for that there are treatments that use the therapeutic relationship and the cognitive and behavioral and affective strategies to address the causative factors and the maintaining processes. So dukkha is quite interesting. When I used to chant about dukkha, it used to be something like this: jatipi dukkha, jarapi dukkha, maranampi dukkha, and this translates as birth, aging, sickness, and death is dukkha. This is at the gross end of the spectrum. Pain, grief, lamentation, and despair is dukkha. Getting what you don't want, not getting what you want, and being parted from what is dear to you or close to you is dukkha. In fact, clinging to a sense of self, clinging to what they call it, in Buddhism we call it the five aggregates that relate to being a self, like the form, feelings, perceptions, mental formations, and consciousness. Clinging to these aspects of self as an abiding, lasting, independent self is intrinsically dukkha. It's a pretty broad spectrum. Sometimes I make a bit of a joke about this when I'm talking about dukkha. It's like at the gross end of the spectrum is really horrible, terrible, gross dukkha, gross pain, like the suffering of war, for example, or the suffering of painful illnesses. And at the other end of the spectrum, we have this subtle unsatisfactoriness. This, like, for example, not getting your soy chai latte exactly the way you want it. So there's this experience of unsatisfactoriness that we all experience. And in clinical psychology, of course, we have all sorts of dukkha. There is the dukkha of generalized anxiety disorder, where there is worry. Worry is one of the key features of generalized anxiety disorder. Restlessness or feeling keyed up, feeling fatigued, difficulty concentrating or your mind going blank, irritability, muscle tension, and sleep disturbance. And, we can find lots of dukkha actually in the DSM-5 and the ICD-11. There's all sorts of this idea of dukkha, this experience, this reality of dukkha, encompasses a broad range of human experiences. So the second truth, which is the causes of this dukkha, relates to this interaction between external stimuli and internal stimuli, as well as the way we relate to these stimuli, the way that we relate to these experiences, our subjective responses and reactions to experiences that come our way. It's considered as a sort of cyclic reaction. I've often talked with my clients about how one thing leads to another, leads to another, leads to another. And it's this interdependent cycle that gets us caught up in our descending spirals of suffering, descending spirals of dukkha. So the root causes of dukkha, according to the teachings of Buddha, are that the root causes are greed, ignorance, and hatred. Greed relates to our addictions to pleasant feelings, or craving, grasping, and clinging. Ignorance or delusion about and ignoring things relates to misinterpretation, misperceiving, misunderstanding, just not seeing things as they really are, like having the veils of delusion filtering our perceptions. And hatred refers to rejection, fear, avoidance, struggle with, and condemnation of unpleasant feelings, or simply aversion. So there's a principle that the Buddha talked about that is evident in the Four Truths, and it's also evident in how suffering arises, and also how freedom from suffering arises. So it's quite complicated. It's called dependent arising, and the principle is difficult to understand. Nonetheless, it's referred to regularly in the sutras in this way. When this is, that is. Because this arises, that arises. When this is not, that is not. Because this ceases, that ceases. So what this means is, it means that when we have the causes of dukkha, then we're going to experience the result of that, which is suffering. But if there's no causes for dukkha, then no suffering arises, no dukkha arises. So this particular principle can be adapted to all sorts of things. So what happens here, if we think about the root causes of dukkha, being greed, ignorance and hatred, and if we can reduce those root causes or even uproot them, then we don't have any suffering in relationship to that. So one way we can do that is by cultivating their opposites. So the opposite of greed, of course, is letting go and cultivating generosity. The opposite of ignorance is cultivating insight and wisdom and developing acceptance and peace with the reality of things, the way things actually are. And the opposite of hatred is, of course, cultivating goodwill, cultivating compassion, benevolence, and appreciation. The third truth relates to freedom, and in Pali it's called Nibbana, in Sanskrit it's called Nirvana, and I've heard that one way this is translated is literally as unbinding, not feeding into passions or not feeding into the causes of suffering. So we unbind, we short circuit our patterns of cycling in suffering. Both at relative and ultimate levels, and what I mean by this, that at an ultimate level it's like complete freedom. At a relative level, it's sort of a relative freedom, like to the extent that we can let go of those tendencies that lead into suffering or lead into dukkha, to that extent we can experience freedom from that dukkha. And we can think about clinical disorders in this way as well. When depression is understood as being maintained by unhealthy ruminations, when we're no longer fueling our ruminations, then the tendency to relapse with depression is reduced or ceases. When ruminative thoughts are no longer believed as facts, then one is freed from the cycles of depression. And if you think about GAD or generalized anxiety disorder, which, as I mentioned earlier, is one of the key features is worry. But if you are able to put worry aside and not buy into it, and then not get entangled in the anguish of this particular tendency, then that anguish is reduced or abandoned. We also no longer worry about worry. The fourth truth is called the Noble Eightfold Path, or the Ennobling Eightfold Path, and it involves pathways of freedom that involve cultivating that which is helpful or wholesome, and letting go or abandoning, short-circuiting and extinguishing that which is unhelpful or unwholesome. And it is all workable. The Eightfold Path involves three components. These are wisdom, ethics or virtue, and meditation or cultivation. Traditionally we have the term right in front of every factor on this path. And we have right view, right intention, right speech, right action, right livelihood, right effort, right mindfulness or right energy, right mindfulness, and right concentration. The term right actually is a translation of the term samma. And other ways we can understand samma is by thinking about them as complete, authentic, fully skillful, appropriate, or correct. Usually the term right is used in the sense of understanding that there's a right direction and a wrong direction. If I was to travel from Lismore to Sydney, I would go south. That would be the right direction. If I started heading north to Brisbane, then I'm going in the wrong direction. It's as simple as that. So these factors on the path involve aspects of view, intention, speech, action, livelihood, energy, mindfulness and concentration in a way that is right for the direction of freedom. So right view refers to understanding that all things change. And it also understands that things that are impermanent cannot be the source of enduring happiness. In other words, dukkha. They're dukkha. They have a dukkha nature. And I also understand that everything is interdependent. There's no single lasting thing in all this. It's a result of things coming together, causes and conditions, and there's no solid abiding self in all this or thing in all this. Sometimes this is called not self or empty or in Pali anatta. The other aspect of right view, another aspect of right view is that causes have effects, actions have consequences. And it's an understanding of dependent arising. Understanding that things come about because of causes and conditions coming together and our intentions with experiences that come our way. And there's no single abiding self in all this. It's just the coming together of causes and conditions. So this is what we mean by right view. Right intentions. Right intentions. Right intentions. There's three types of right intentions: goodwill, harmlessness, and renunciation. So goodwill refers to warm friendliness, benevolence, compassion, gratitude, etc. towards oneself and others. Harmlessness refers to not causing harm to self or others, and it could include compassion. Renunciation, another way of thinking about renunciation is letting go, and it involves the release of grasping, clinging, craving, and views, craving after views, concepts, experiences, and so on. And it is releasing gross happiness for a higher happiness. It is that renunciation of gross happiness or gross pleasure for a higher pleasure. Right intentions can also refer to right thought, decisions, or aspirations. And aspirations are wishes and visions for the future, arising as intentions in the here and now. But it's really helpful to have a wholesome aspiration, because when you can have a wholesome aspiration, it'll increase the possibility that something will occur, something that you're aiming for will actually arise. It's interesting because in neuropsychology, they also talk about, there's that phrase, that which fires together wires together. And imagination can actually activate neuronal growth. So this is imagination or intention can actually begin the process of neuroplasticity in a positive way. The other aspect of the Eightfold Path, after right view, right intention, is ethics. And this generally involves right speech, right action, right livelihood. And right speech is speech that is truthful and useful, leading to unity and harmony and peace. Right action is that action that doesn't harm, again, leading to unity, harmony and peace. And right livelihood refers to making a living, or living in a way that promotes the welfare and happiness for ourselves and others. And I'm adding here, ethics includes sensitivity to suffering with a commitment to reduce it. In other words, compassion. So that third component of the Eightfold Path, the group of energy, mindfulness and concentration, is referred to as meditation. And in Pali, the word for meditation is bhavana. And bhavana literally means to cultivate, to bring into being. And what we cultivate in Theravadan Buddhist meditation at least, is serenity and insight. And what we use is energy, mindfulness, and there's many definitions of mindfulness, and I'm using one from Analio Bhikkhu here as soft awake presence, and concentration. Concentration here means samadhi, which is the bringing together, the gathering in of attention and placing it in one spot. Bringing it in and placing it in one spot. And it's like a settling of the mind. So serenity, these two aspects of meditation, serenity and insight, work together. And serenity involves relaxation, stability of attention, absorption, and clarity. Serenity utilizes joy, tranquility, and concentration. And insight, this other end of the meditation spectrum, this other aspect of meditation, involves seeing dependent arising, basically, seeing cause-effect relationships, and also seeing the three characteristics of existence, being impermanence, unsatisfactoriness, and emptiness. And this aspect, insight aspect of meditation, involves utilizing mindfulness, investigation, and energy, primarily. Just as a matter of interest, there are 7 factors of awakening, and the first 3 are related to insight, mindfulness, investigation of phenomena, and energy. The next 3 are related to serenity, involving rapture or joy, or piti in Pali, tranquility and unification, or samadhi. And mindfulness, insight and serenity can both independently lead to equanimity. And in the 7 factors of awakening, these 7 factors culminate, they're in sequence, and they culminate in equanimity, which is just thought I'd throw that little piece of information in. The Eightfold Path has ennobling and noble levels. What I mean by ennobling and noble is that the Noble Eightfold Path refers to experiences of ultimate freedom. It refers to experiences of nibbana, complete freedom from greed, ignorance, and hatred, and therefore being no suffering. That's the Noble Eightfold Path. The Ennobling Eightfold Path involves us moving towards ultimate freedom, but not necessarily experiencing nibbana or nirvana, but finding some relative freedom nonetheless. It's our efforts towards working with everyday difficulties, sufferings such as stress, anxiety, and depression, but in a way there where we're finding some relief, finding some liberation, finding some freedom from these afflictions, but not to the extent of being completely free, like not to the extent of nibbana. And this is very important. This is what most of us work with, and what we work with a lot in, say, clinical psychology. And let's take an example of someone who might be experiencing social phobia. Now, with social phobia, they're anxious about speaking up in front of people because there's a fear of those people judging them negatively, and so they tend to avoid doing things like making themselves go. They avoid going out socially, avoid going to parties, going to meet new people, and they definitely avoid speaking up in public places or on giving public talks and so on. And it results in them never doing anything. And this is suffering. A lot of people suffer with social phobia. However, by turning towards the experience of social phobia in a way that's supported by psychological resources of, say, serenity or calm or relaxation, or the support of a therapist or something like that, by turning towards our difficult experience we're able to see into it and see its causes and see its how we feed into it. And we're developing an ennobling understanding, an ennobling insight. And with that insight, we make a decision to do something about it. We make a decision not to feed into it anymore, but to do something different that is leading towards relative freedom from it. So we might act with our behaviours in a way that is in line with our good understanding and our best intentions. And this could include, say, something like graduated exposure tasks, such as giving talks to your family rather than going out and doing public speaking, and getting practice at it, maybe increasing the number of people you're giving little talks about and increasing the length of time, and so on and so forth, countering that tendency to avoid being exposed to the possibility of criticism. And gradually, over time, we develop insight about the fact that maybe they're not even thinking about us, or I'm doing pretty good anyway, or whatever it is, that one overcomes and finds freedom from this this affliction. So, coming back to the ennobling Eightfold Path, we develop an understanding about social phobia. We have good intentions to act in ways that will counter it. Then we act in ways that are counter it. We act in ways that are not feeding into our suffering. In fact, feeding into our liberation from this particular type of suffering with our actions of body, speech, and life. And then we have a level of composure sufficient enough to investigate it, to become focused on it, to see into it a little bit deeper with our meditation, with mindfulness and concentration and energy. And then that leads on to having more understanding and more good intentions and so on and so forth. This Eightfold Path is often considered like a wheel that's turning. There's 8 spokes on the wheel, and the wheel is turning and increasing with its momentum in a way that leads to freedom. The Four Truths and the teaching of the Buddha has often been compared to, or symbolized as, a beautiful lotus growing out of the sludge and slime and compost at the bottom of the pond. It's by turning towards and understanding our dukkha that we then have the opportunity to grow and wake up to freedom from it. Often our experiences of stress, psychological turmoil, and catastrophes are the greatest triggers or the greatest stimulants for us that lead often to great awakenings and freedom. And there's actually a growing body of research about something called post-traumatic growth and even post-traumatic transformation right now. So as Thich Nhat Hanh, the late Venerable Thich Nhat Hanh says, no mud, no lotus. So it's an opportunity to relish in our dukkha. It's the opportunity to be free. And in the Buddha's first discourse, the one he talked about, the one where he talked about, it's actually called the turning of the wheel of Dharma discourse. He talked about the Four Noble Truths and the Eightfold Path, and he also described these truths as tasks. And I'm talking about, Stephen Batchelor talks about them as tasks. And they have a sequence. It's a sequence that goes through symbolically like the lotus growing out of the mud. So the first task related to the first truth is being willing to acknowledge dukkha, being willing to face up to this reality, to get to know it. The task is to understand it. And of the second truth, the task is to, first of all, we realize the root causes, the unhelpful patterns and the destructive habits, and then we let them go. The task of the second truth is to abandon these habits, to release them. And when that happens, that leads on to the third truth in this kind of sequence from the, through this growth of this beautiful lotus from the mud. The task of the third truth, that is freedom, is to realize it. To realize it by abandoning and relinquishing the causes of dukkha. And once we realize it, we have the fourth truth, which is to practice the path, to live a life of freedom, to be free in this, to have our beautiful lotuses grow from our terrible circumstances sometimes, to grow from our dukkha. So thank you very much. I'm going to invite you to some reflections now. Now I'd like to invite you to a reflection. And it's a reflection on stress and using the Four Noble Truths or the Four Ennobling Truths as a way of considering stress. And first of all, I'd like you to settle. I'd invite you to settle into your body. Get a little bit focused. Put down, if you've got any pens in your hand, put down your pens. Unless you want to take notes about the experience. And just settle into your body for a moment. Settle into the present. And consider, how do we humans experience stress? How does it make us feel physically and emotionally? Just sift back in your mind to remember times when you felt a bit stressed. And using a Dan Siegel model of SIFT, what are the sensations, imagery, feelings and thoughts of this experience? It's usually unpleasant. And what emotions are related to it, what thoughts are related to it, what are the physical sensations of this experience of stress? Remember it. Or if you're feeling stressed right now, tune into it. And on the next reflection, I invite you to consider what feeds into stress. What feeds into stress? Putting aside stressful circumstances or the things that happen to ourselves externally, what attitudes, behaviors, reactions, etc. seem to make stress worse? What feeds into the human experience of stress? How do you feed into it? And next, I'd invite you to reflect on the experience of freedom from stress. What would it be like to be stress-free? Or what is it like to be stress-free? Even relatively. How do you experience this? What is it like for us humans to experience genuine happiness, peace and contentment? Perhaps you've got a memory of it. And if you don't have a memory of it, perhaps you can imagine what it's like to directly experience freedom. Freedom from stress. Checking out how it feels in your body, what's happening with your mind, your emotions, your thoughts, and letting your imagination go freely in the direction of peace, genuine happiness, and freedom. And finally, I invite you to reflect on the ways we can find freedom from stress. And what have you noticed about the ways humans relate to their experience of stress that is conducive to freedom from it? And what are some of the factors of this relationship? In other words, what are some ways we can find happiness, peace, and contentment? How can we practice on the path? How can you practice on your path to finding freedom from stress? So thank you. I trust you found that exercise helpful. I hope you did. And I just want to finish this presentation off with a bit of a discussion about my experience with the teachings of the Buddha, personal experience with teachings of the Buddha, and how I've used that with clinical psychology. So I first began interest in Buddhism and practicing meditation in 1975 when I was 19 years old. And at that time, I'd come from a traumatic adolescence, experiencing a lot of alcohol-related domestic violence and family breakdown. So I was a little bit kind of unsettled. And I found that the teachings of the Buddha were very helpful to help me sort out some of my issues. And I ordained in Thailand in 1977. Buddhist psychology offered me practical strategies to work on my own mental health issues. And I found sati, or mindfulness, was a wonderful way to short-circuit worry and rumination and anxiety. It was also powerful to lift my depressive moods when I was down, and I got ill, I got quite seriously ill in Thailand. I suffered with malaria and later on hepatitis, and it was pretty difficult to keep a positive state of mind. But it helped me, mindfulness and the practice in general. And also I'd get down from being away from the security of home, being in a foreign country. I was living in a temple there, nobody else spoke English. So, I found the teachings were very, very helpful. And mindfulness also became a way for me to be present and needing to care for myself in a way that was most helpful rather than freaking out I was thinking about death a lot, and that was quite useful. But essentially, remembering to be here now was my refuge. And mindfulness was just one practice. Also found practicing the four divine abodes, loving kindness, compassion, appreciative joy, and equanimity, particularly helpful to heal fractured relationships with myself and others. And as I mentioned just a moment ago, I thought about death a lot, and death contemplation is one of the contemplations in Buddhist practices. I found it a very powerful tool to help me and appreciate being in the moment and find some peace with every breath. And also, so not only was it character building and freeing from sort of everyday stresses and anxieties and depression, but also I also had some very intense spiritual experiences. And these experiences left an enduring taste of freedom in my heart that has continued up until, the present. Though I spent a lot of time, here's a picture, I spent a lot of time in this cave, and this is part of the temple I was in. I was in a temple called Wat Doi Dhamma Jetty. And it was a wonderful experience. And I eventually disrobed and came back to Australia in 1980. And by 1985, I decided I needed some livelihood, so I went to university, studied psychology, and I found that psychology was studying psychology at university was okay. It wasn't very inspiring, but I persisted nonetheless, and I got a job in about 1991 or something like that as a psychologist out west, and I found that the university training that I had as a general psychologist wasn't very practical, and I found that when I was challenged with domestic violence, suicide, not my own suicide, but working with clients who are suicidal, and substance abuse, and a whole raft of different quite serious mental health issues. I had to study a lot, but I also found that the teachings of the Buddha gave me a capacity to stay centered and stay composed and cope with that onslaught of difficulties. So I practiced as a psychologist for 10 years, as a general psychologist, and then I went back to university. I went back to university after about 6 years, I think, and became a clinical psychologist. And I found clinical psychology very interesting. I found that the study of clinical psychology was really valuable to help me understand what to do with my clients. It was really interesting, it was really inspiring, and very, very helpful. So I guess the way I am now, I've been a psychologist for over 30 years, and the way I integrate these two approaches has been by using the teachings of the Buddha as an overarching umbrella paradigm for understanding at a subjective level what leads to psychological suffering and what leads to its freedom, with practical strategies to achieve that freedom. The way I've used clinical psychology is by understanding contemporary scientifically validated clinical approaches, provide an understanding of what works with whom and when, and how to apply specific skills with tailored interventions. So there's this, I found that it's been quite a balance when it's come to training others in meditation and related skills such as mindfulness and compassion. I found the teachings of the Buddha most sophisticated and comprehensive. This, of course, has been complemented by wonderful contemporary perspectives such as compassion-focused therapy, mindful self-compassion, and neuroscience with the neuroplasticity explored with Dan Siegel and Rick Hansen and more. I feel very fortunate to have a Buddhist training. I found that it's given me a lovely balance, and it's been very helpful. So thank you for your attention. Let's have some questions and discussion.